150 years ago, out on the prairie of the northern Great Plains, hunters sat on sagebrush-covered hills, marveling at seemingly endless herds of bison. For as long as Americans had known this land, these animals had existed in the tens of millions. And these hunters surely thought that this abundance would last just as long into the future. This wealth of wildlife was assumed to be infinite, here forever, taken for granted. But it did end. By the late 1880s, the great American bison herd had plummeted from somewhere north of 30 million all the way down to possibly fewer than 1,000 individuals. Today, while the specifics are obviously different, some are beginning to ask if we are witnessing another disappearing act of unbelievable proportions. In the far north of our continent and the wider world beyond, once seemingly endless herds of caribou, some numbering in the many hundreds of thousands, are blinking nearly out of existence. The greatest aggregation of large mammals in North America, our own version of the vast migrating herds of the Serengeti, are disappearing. Migratory Arctic caribou populations have dropped across the world by 65% in just the last 2 decades. Herds that once numbered more than 500,000 have been reduced to just tens of thousands. And yet few seem to be taking notice. What is going on with caribou? Why is this happening? Are we unknowingly witnessing the end of one of our wild world's greatest wonders? My guest today has been asking these questions for himself, and with a unique set of first-hand experience to aid him. Jim Dau is an Alaskan, a caribou hunter, and prior to his retirement, was one of the foremost caribou biologists in our nation. After nearly 3 decades tracking, monitoring, and studying the Western Arctic caribou herd for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. I've asked Jim to join me here to discuss his life lived close to caribou, the many ways in which these remarkable creatures impact the land, animals, and people that surround them, and his firsthand insight into the widespread decline of these animals and the factors that might be at play. Thanks for being here. This is Future Wild, brought to you by Conservation First Bank. Jim Dau, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
I want to dive right into things and start where most stories would begin, which is at the beginning. And I'm curious, when you look back on your career, was there any one moment or experience or adventure out there in the field when you realized that caribou and the Western Arctic was where you needed to spend the rest of your career and much of your life? Does anything stand out as that pivotal moment for you?
Maybe not one, but there were probably 20 over the course of my career. I worked with caribou, Central Arctic caribou, different herd than this one, during my graduate work back in 82 to 85, and found them just fascinating. But it was graduate work, and I wasn't sure if I'd continue in caribou. Heck, I didn't even know if I'd get a job, but I'd have taken anything. But then I got hired in Kotzebue, Alaska, to be an area biologist. So I worked with everything out here: wolves, bears, Dall sheep, moose, caribou. And after doing that for about 10 years, we had a personnel change in the office, and they said, "Boy, we really need to get you an assistant." And I said, "Boy, I don't need an assistant. What you need to do is fire me as the AB, hire another person as an AB, and make me a Western Arctic herd caribou biologist." And they agreed. I said, it'll be better in a 2-person office. Somebody doesn't want to be an assistant for 20 years. They want to call the shots for their area, and you'll have a better chance of retaining people if we're equals instead of me supervising one person. So they did that. And it was a decision, kind of a joint decision that I've never regretted. It worked out really well for me, and I think the people that were working as the area biologists. Luckily for me, it meant that I'm a pilot. I was a pilot for Fish and Game as well as a biologist, so I didn't have to give up the moose work and the bear work and the sheep work. I still flew on all those projects. But what I thought about and the data I managed and analyzed, that was all caribou data.
Okay. What is it about caribou uniquely of all those different species you've been able to work with that stands out? There's so many different uh, features of the species, of the individual and of the broader species that could stand out. I imagine when I look at them from afar, when I think about my handful of experiences with them, but you having this up close, such a long runway with them. When you look at that animal, what stands out to you as making them extraordinary?
Well, I think one thing that appealed to me, besides just the fascinating natural history, really, if you look hard enough at any animal, they all have fascinating life histories. That's one of the beauties of wildlife, whether you're, enjoying them recreationally or you're making a living, studying them. But with caribou, one of the things that really stood out for me was they are so important, both ecologically as well as socially to people. There were lots and lots of commercial operators out here, big game guides, transporters that provided transport services to hunters. And then virtually everybody that lives in Northwest Alaska relies on caribou for their principal source of terrestrial protein. So I can't think of another single species where more things hinged on their biological well-being than caribou.
Hmm. That's a great point. Just the scale, the breadth of landscape that they can also cover, and the scale of that, any one individual herd, I can see being something that leads to that too, which is pretty remarkable and exceptional. The numbers that they can appear in on this continent is unsurpassed today, right?
Well, caribou herds are fascinating, whether they number 300 or 500 animals or all the way up to 500,000 caribou, like the Western Arctic herd did back in the early 2000s. Um, the Western Arctic herd is not only one of the largest, or was one of the largest herds in North America, probably the world, but it also has one of the longest migrations. And one of the things that is just truly fascinating about this herd is you'd see them doing these inexplicable things. You just couldn't fathom, how do they do that? I asked that question of myself hundreds of times over the course of my career. How do they do this? An example is during fall migrations. I saw this probably a half a dozen times during my career. But right in the middle of the fall migration, when they should have been on the march, all of them heading south, they'd stop. The entire herd would stop, and they'd be stopped for, gosh, sometimes 4 or 5 days, a week. And within a day or two, they would all be moving again. And I thought, how do they do this? It's not just the animals out on the coast or the ones inland or in the mountains. Well, they must be responding to weather or some big umbrella cue that's affecting them all equally. So I looked at weather in these different areas where the caribou were, and it was not weather. In some places it was cold, other places it was not, some places snowing, some places not. I don't know how they did this, but by the time I retired, my definition of a group of caribou was completely different than what it was going into my career. It's not 20 or 30 or 100 animals that are all kind of shoulder and shoulder moving through the willows. Uh, it's like this meta being, this caribou herd, and I'm convinced, I don't know how they do it, but I am convinced that caribou out here on the coast somehow knew what caribou were doing hundreds of miles inland. Can't explain it, but I
Hmm.
saw it too many times to just say, "Oh, it's just random chance." It wasn't random chance. These things are incredible.
Yeah. So I took my first road trip from the Midwest to the Rocky Mountains as an adult when I was 21, I think. And I remember the first time I drove across the Great Plains. And now, almost every year since, every time I go across the Great Plains, I always find myself at some moment coming over some hill and thinking to myself, what must it have been like 200 some years ago when Lewis and Clark or somebody else came over one of these grassy hills and looked out over the plains for miles and miles and saw buffalo as far as the eye could see. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of buffalo that would stream past them for days on end. What must that have been like? I constantly find myself nostalgic for what that experience must have felt like, the awe that must have inspired. And you uniquely, and anyone who has had the good fortune of getting to be in the Arctic and see some of these remaining caribou herds that we have still, have gotten to experience something very much like that. I don't think many people take the time to realize that we still have that to a degree in the far north. What is that like? What is that experience like to see a wildlife spectacle like that? Of these hundreds of thousands of caribou that have been part of that Western Arctic herd that you mentioned. Can you share that? Is there any way to put words to that?
Well, it's phenomenal. I wasn't born in Alaska. I didn't grow up here. I grew up in the northern Michigan, the Midwest. I came to Alaska straight out of the Navy back in 1976. And so you're right, I was extremely fortunate to work with great people and to work with the Western Arctic herd and just work in really remote areas. And having come from the Midwest, I never took it for granted. It was always kind of a tingly moment when you saw something that was truly remarkable. I can remember doing several caribou photocensuses. We'd do those in July when insect harassment was bad. The caribou would get all grouped up, and then we'd have a photo plane come in. They'd fly transects over the big groups, photograph them, we'd count them. That's how we got population estimates. Several times in my career, I saw aggregations numbering over 250,000 caribou. One time, we were doing preliminary radio tracking. We knew it was too windy and cold. We wouldn't have photography possibilities for the next day or so, but we wanted to see how close the collars were together to have an idea how fast the big photographable aggregations could form. And we got there, and it was incredible. Essentially, the entire Western Arctic herd was in one big spread out group. They were pretty dispersed, which made it even more impressive. But as far as you could see, in about 3 directions were caribou going out of sight. And it was really something. I was I don't know, 1,000 or 1,500 feet in a cub. And I think I had a little point and shoot camera, and I tried to get this, just a few pictures to show people. And it was really disappointing. You just had to be there. The camera could not capture it, which in itself is pretty remarkable. But I am so fortunate to have worked with this herd when I did and to live in Northwest Alaska now.
Yeah. What about when you're on the ground with a herd, when they're moving through? I know you've had a number of different, really interesting experiences. I want to ask you about the onion portage experience, but what's it like when you are surrounded by these animals, when they're passing through? I've heard about the sounds. I've heard about a lot of different things from different people when you're out there with that migration amidst it. What's that experience like?
It varies seasonally. If you're in amongst the caribou in the winter, it's quiet. It's just still. And they're not vocalizing then. The cows are not grunting to their calves. The calves are big enough. They're not constantly calling for mom. It's amazing that you can be, in the middle of thousands of caribou and not hear anything, but you can see them. If you're in the middle of them, say in July when the insects are harassing them and they're forming these big aggregations, completely different experience, sensory experience on the ground. We used to try to collect composition data in July because you'd have minimal segregation by bulls, cows, and calves. And so we'd get ahead of these groups. We'd radio track them. We'd land in front of them, get set up, and the caribou would just, as long as you stayed still, they'd walk right by it. They just divide, and the It's their feet. They've got these tendons in their feet, and so with every step, caribou hoof makes a little click. And so when the caribou, they'd be going by it, sometimes 20, 30 feet away. It sounded like you were in a forest in a real light breeze, all
Hmm.
these clicks, clicks, clicks. And it was really a beautiful sound. But not only did you hear them, you got to smell them.
Hmm.
They have this wonderful, and if you've ever harvested a caribou and you bury your nose in its hair, you smell this. You can smell the lanolin in their hide, in their hair. And oh, it was really cool. And then, of course, the females and calves, the cows and calves were talking to each other all the time, especially as they went by us. The deep guttural grunts of the cows telling juniors, stay by me, stay on my flank. And the calf saying, okay, okay, okay. It's just almost deafening. It's really wonderful.
You mentioned these aggregations that they have, and that's one of the interesting things that, as I have studied caribou further, I discovered that I'd never realized before, was just the profound impact that bugs and mosquitoes actually have on these animals. And then they're not just seemingly an annoyance, but actually a life or death threat in some circumstances. Can you expand on that a little bit? Why it's so important for them to have places to avoid the mosquitoes, and it seems like many times the calving grounds are places that specifically are there where they can avoid that to some degree, and then they move on to these post calving aggregation sites. I'd love to hear more about that because I think that's so unique compared to so many other species, that I think people would be interested in learning about.
I think caribou are unique in how affected they are by insect harassment. I've watched muskox and moose and bears, and they combat insects by having lots of thick hair even during the insect season. And I've never really seen muskox respond to mosquitoes, or that's mostly what gets muskox. They're up around their eyes and their nose, but they just stand there just like a big wad of hair. They can't get through all the hair. Moose will occasionally go lay down in water, and they go into lakes to wash the bugs. They have lots of biting flies that bite the short hair on their nose. They can get through that short hair. And so they will respond to insects a little bit. But with caribou, I think insect harassment is probably the most underrated population of factor that affects caribou. You hear about winters, deep snow, cold, icing events. You hear about snow machines and disturbance and roads and disturbance. I think during summer, there's really only about one thing that really affects caribou, and that's insect harassment. Of course, that's all mediated by weather, but it affects our movements. It's you hear about the migrations, and they're traveling. When they're traveling during migrations, it's pretty much a steady walk, and it's net distance traveled every day. They're going south, southwest, but it's always net movement. Um, During the summer insect season, you get a lot of what's called aberrant running, which means it's like entropy in action. They can head north, they can head south. If there's any kind of a breeze, they'll always run into the breeze. But when insect harassment is the worst, there's no breeze. And so they make their breeze by running. And those caribou, I've radio tracked them, and they can go without batting an eye. They can go 50 or 75 miles a day, even calves that at that point are, 4, 5, 6 weeks old. Um, they form these incredibly dense aggregations. The aggregations can be so dense that when we would photograph them, they were almost impossible to count because they were shoulder to shoulder. It was almost like trying to count walrus out on the ice when they're laying on top of each other. They're so dense, it's hard to get a decent count of them, especially when they're on snowfields. They go on snowfields because it's cooler just above the snow. They lay down in that snow, but also they can see the estrid flies, especially the nose spots. They put their head down, they can see the flies against the sky. or if they got their head up, they can see them against the snow. When they're out in the vegetation, they can't see that well. So it affects every aspect of caribou ecology in the summer in terms of their movements and their behavior, how much time they spend eating, ruminating versus just traveling to make a breeze to stay out of them. When they form the densest aggregations and the most severe insect harassment, the group will stay in one spot, but they will run like they're inside a corral. I don't know if you've ever seen anything corralled in an actual
Yeah.
corral. I don't even know if like cattle do this, but it looks like they are in a fenced-in compound, but they will run as hard as they can go on the outside in a circle. It's like a big spinning wheel. The animals in the center are just standing there. They're the axle, but the ones on the outside are going just as hard as they can possibly go. This has the potential to be a deadly activity for calves. They get separated from their mothers. And I've seen these big spinning groups. There's actually a term for this. It's a German term, and I can't remember the name of it. But the calves get separated from their mothers. They fall down, they get trampled. And I think it can be a significant source of mortality in the summer, depending on the size of the group they're in and how many times they do this in a summer. So the other thing that affects all of them, even the ones that are not being trampled, is it affects how much time they spend eating, ruminating, versus burning calories. And in really bad bug years, they come off the summer range, not mud fat like they want to be. They're, in some years, I've seen them come off the North Slope, Western Arctic caribou, where they have very, very little fat, especially the females that have been lactating all summer. So anyway, insect harassment is not just kind of an annoyance like it is for us, smear out some more bug dope. It can be life and death for those guys.
So I'm curious to learn more about how all of this data was collected, how we've learned so much about these movements. You mentioned earlier the aerial surveys that help you guys estimate population, where you flew over these large aggregations, took photos, and then counted. I understand actually counted all of those as best as possible to get an estimate. But what about the movement data? I understand that the radio collar program was a huge part of what you helped with and that what you were involved with. And there's a unique area where this was done to some degree called the onion portage. I've read a bit about it in some of Seth Kantner's books, and I'd love to hear about what you did there, how you radio collared these caribou, and what that helped you understand about them.
Well, about 90 or 95% of all the information we use to manage the Western Arctic herd during my career was based on radio telemetry data. I started working in Kotzebue back in 1988. And back then, satellite telemetry was just barely becoming available, not to people with big research money, but to people, working biologists like me, field biologists that wanted this just for nuts and bolts survey and inventory activities. So when I got here, I think we had 5 satellite collars deployed in the Western Arctic herd. And we put those collars out for 2 reasons. We wanted to see if they'd work. And then also we really wanted to have some even little tiny kernel of data where to go to find the collars that we had been using since about the 1970s. So conventional radio telemetry had been around about 20 or 25 years. So those 5 collars, we quickly lost 2 of them. So we were down to 3, but it was amazing just having 3 collars that we could access the data online. And they would tell us, man, you need to go a lot farther north and east than we usually do. There's this collar up there, and I'll bet there's some conventional collars too. It really made us more efficient in doing the radio tracking surveys. With the satellite telemetry collars, all the data just comes to your computer, so it doesn't make any difference if it's winter solstice and we've got an hour and 42 minutes of sort of daylight, or the middle of July, when you've got 24 hours of daylight. That data came in, the satellite telemetry data came in every day. Good weather, bad weather, whatever. For the conventional radio callers, you had to get out in little airplanes with antennas, you had a receiver, and you flew around until you picked up a signal, and then you could track in directionally, find the caribou. You could record things like whether or not she still had a calf, group size, group location. But I think most of the biologists in the field today probably have almost no experience actually having to do conventional radio telemetry tracking flights like that we did all the time back in the 80s. It all is fed to them over their computer. Everybody's putting out satellite callers now. You can get other information too. You can get like ambient air temperature. You can have sensors in the transmitters that'll pick that up. You can get activity monitors that'll tell you not whether they're trotting or running or feeding, but it can tell you basically how active they are. You don't know what they're doing. You don't know if they're digging a hole or if they're trotting, but you can tell they're more active than they were the previous 5 hours when they were just laying there. So there's all kinds of information you can get from telemetry information. We were most concerned with distribution, movement patterns, and then mortality and productivity. And then even more important than productivity is something we called recruitment. It's how many of your calves live to, at least past their first year. After their first year, we couldn't really say they had been recruited into the population because most caribou cows don't reproduce until they're 3. And we didn't collar calves. When we did, the collars were on only 6 to 9 months to see what initial survival was. But telemetry was really the backbone of the Western Arctic Herd S&I program, survey and inventory program. And I think it's that way for most caribou herds and probably the world now.
Yeah. So how did you get these collars on these caribou?
When I got here in '88, they had just started kind of an experimental study to see if they could catch caribou as they were crossing the Kobuk River. They had to swim this big river. There was a place called Onion Portage that you referred to earlier, and it had been well documented as a place where indigenous people, Inupiaq people, had hunted caribou for millennia. They had data going back, archaeological data going back about 9 or 10,000 years. And that site had been used continuously for that time. So this was before I came on. I think the first year they did this was 85 or 86. But they took boats up there just to see if they could do it, catch caribou in the water, and they could. It wasn't easy. They had actually lassos, and they would get a boat up within 20 or 30 feet, and they'd throw this lasso, and they'd catch some by the antlers and haul them over to the boat.
Wow.
But we figured out it was a whole lot easier on the caribou and us to just drive the boat next to them, grab an antler, and then you've got them. The project evolved a lot. The main reason why they wanted to do that was the alternative to catching them by hand. The only way to get them was to use helicopters. And back then, this was before net gunning had become widely practiced. So it was chemical immobilization from a dart gun, and there's problems with that. Capture mortality was much higher when using chemical immobilization back then than it is now. But the thing, they weren't, and it's not that they were killing lots of caribou. The hardest thing about using chemical immobilization with helicopters was Northwest Alaska is, at least 500 miles from the nearest helicopter back then. And there were very few helicopters in Alaska. So they often couldn't get a helicopter to go out and do the capture work up here because they were trying to capture caribou and then Alchina herd and maybe the Mulchatna herd and all these herds that were closer. So they thought, man, we've got to have something that's cheaper, is less expensive, and that we can do on our own. We don't have to depend on getting helicopters. Let's try catching them in the river. So they did that, and lo and behold, it worked. The side benefit of that they really hadn't been thinking about, was that local people never liked the idea of chasing caribou with helicopters. They said, this is cruel. This is splitting up cows and calves. This is really hard on them. You shouldn't do this. And so they started onion portage just to make it more economical and feasible for the biologists. A huge side benefit of that was that it didn't involve chasing caribou for, a half a mile or more with a helicopter. So not only did we save money, we reduced mortality, and it was much more readily accepted by local people that they weren't real keen on collars either back in the 1970s and 80s. But they said, well, this is a lot better than, doing it the other way. So that kind of sealed the deal. And from 1986 until about 4 or 5 years ago, that's the only way we collared Western Arctic caribou, was from boats. And the nuts and bolts of the capture operation, we handled bulls differently than cows. I could talk about collaring caribou and onion portage for 2 hours. We don't have that much time, but it was a great project. It was one of the best projects, the most enjoyable projects that I did in my annual round of work. One of the things we started doing in conjunction with the collaring project at Onion Portage was we did this in September when caribou were migrating south. And so my original idea was to bring local people out onto the collaring project, hunters. I wanted hunters to see what we were doing, that we were not hurting them. I wanted them to see, how much work it was to get these collars out. And we talked about the information. Well, I called, and everybody was too busy either picking berries or killing caribou for their freezers. They needed meat. So I thought, man, I can't get anybody to come out on this project. And I thought, students, there's a captive audience. They're in school. They're not picking berries. They're not out, every day trying to get caribou like their fathers. And so I talked to a couple of teachers from Norvik, a nearby village. And I said, boy, I've got this project. Would you ever think about bringing some kids up? They could stand on the bank with us. We'll put them in the boat. Long story short, it was a great project. We had 6 or 8 kids from 2 schools, 6 or 8 from one school, 6 or 8 from the next school every fall. And we had them all the way we tried to get high school kids, but we had them as little as, I think, 3rd graders. And it was really good. It was so much fun to interact with the kids. They'd usually bring an elder with them as a kind of a chaperone. And so while we were talking science and showing them about collaring caribou, the kids got to put collars on caribou. The elder, they'd make sure they'd go out and they'd get a bull for camp meat. He'd show them how you shoot a caribou in the water, how you skin it. Here's how you cut it up. And sometimes it'd be an old man and an old woman. And the women would teach the girls, this is how we make caribou soup. This is how we cook the puttock bones. Overall, it was really one of the highlights of my career working on that project.
Wow, that's phenomenal. It sounds like I went to the wrong elementary school, because I would have been all about that. That would have been a great field trip. So you got to be involved in such a fascinating hands-on part of studying this massive herd. As you mentioned, was once the largest caribou herd in Alaska, I believe. And you studied them so closely for so many years in so many different ways and facets of that study. I want to move us forward now into the present day. And something that our shared acquaintance, our friend Bjorn, has frequently brought, just constantly kind of whispering in my ears, hey, are you paying attention to what's going on with caribou? You see the latest numbers with caribou? Did you see the latest article about what's happening? And I have been following that relatively closely, but I'm not sure that the wider world really is. I feel like this is something that's passing in the dark of night, of monumental importance that most Americans have no idea about. So I'm wondering if you could, Jim, very explicitly, for those who maybe have been focused on what's happening in the lower 48 or in their backyard or whatever it might be, What is happening with caribou right now? What is the status of caribou in North America, and what's the trajectory for this species?
Well, I'm glad we talked about onion portage. We could laugh a little bit about that, and that was an uplifting story. But I have to agree with you. I think by and large, most people don't know what's going on with caribou. But what you said with regard to caribou, I think, in the caribou world, the caribou biology world, I was at the North American Caribou Conference back in May of 2023. It was held in Anchorage. It was held in conjunction with the Arctic Ungulate Conference. So there were lots and lots of ungulate biologists. There were over 600 registered participants in that big, huge meeting. And that's what people talked about in the hallways. That's what lots and lots and lots of the presentations were about, was what's going on with caribou. Um, the opening presentation at that North American Caribou Workshop was given by Don Russell, the late Don Russell. He just recently died about a month ago. One of the finest caribou biologists in the world. He and Ann Gunn did a status report on caribou, not just in North America. Both Ann and Don were longtime caribou biologists, ecologists in Canada. And so what they did was, for probably a year or more prior to the conference, they contacted every caribou biologist that had or might have population data for the herd or herds in their areas, and they collected all that, and they gave this status report along with graphs. And we could talk hours just about this. I think her presentation, Anne gave the presentation, it was about an hour and a half long, but I can't remember how many herds. She had data for probably, she thought, 2/3 to 3/4 of the herds in the world. And for the herds that she didn't have data on, it's not that they wouldn't share the data. For the real small herds and then herds in Russia, there just is no data. But for herds with data, probably 2/3 to maybe even 3/4 of the herds were stable at best, or declining, or had already declined, and some of these herds had crashed. Two of the biggest herds in the world, in eastern Canada, the George River herd and the Leaf River herds, they were almost twice as big as the Western Arctic herd at its peak. They were 800 to 900,000 caribou apiece. By the time they gave their presentation, each one of those herds was under 10,000 animals. And it didn't take decades to get there. Those herds crashed. I think it was within a 10 or 12 or 15-year period max. I really think of it that those herds went from 800,000 caribou to less than 10,000 caribou.
Wow.
In like 10 years. In addition to that, she had range maps for these herds. So she'd show you where the herd was. And she said, boy, for the herds that have been the best studied, we not only know where their home range is, we can see how that's shifted over the last 10, 20 years. And for the herds with that kind of information, not only were the herds, much, much smaller than they had been 10, 20 years before that, the ranges had shifted north. She didn't have a lot of information about what was driving these declines. That's always the next question people want to know. Well, why is this happening? And there was no real data-driven conclusions that she could offer, because I think people know, some of the things that are affecting caribou. I thought I knew what was driving Western Arctic herd numbers, at least predominantly, but I can't tell you the whole big picture. I don't have it all ironed out. But again, going back to their status report, this is caribou herds throughout the Northern Hemisphere. So with Scandinavian herds, they had a little data out of Russia on wild reindeer herds, the Canadian herds, Alaskan herds. And one of the amazing things was when you looked at the onset of these declines, they didn't all start declining on this year. It was over about a 20-year period that these herds around the Northern Hemisphere started their declines. They didn't all just drop off the edge like the George River and Leaf River herds did. Some of them tapered off pretty slowly. A lot of them didn't, though. They dropped off. Um, but as she went through her slides in her presentation, herd by herd by herd, I thought, we being caribou biologists and people who use and depend on caribou, we've never seen anything like this before, where so many herds, all the herds, most of the herds, like I said, probably 2/3 to 3/4 of the herds all started a decline within about a 20-year window, which is just the blink of an eye in terms of caribou time. This is new. And so I don't know of any paper that has definitively linked global warming to these caribou declines, but I can't think of any other umbrella factor that could be affecting so many herds over such a huge geographic area in such a short window of time other than climate change. Now, what makes it tough for the researchers and the biologists to try and write this definitive paper is that rising temperatures affect different areas and thus different herds, I think, differently. It's not just temperature rise and, they just, they overheat and they die. It's not that. But there's lots and lots of data coming in from throughout the world how these warming temperatures are changing overall biomass, species composition of lichens and forbs that caribou depend on. For the Western Arctic herd, I thought, and this was before climate change really became a buzzword, but starting around 2000, I started seeing much more frequent icing events during winter than I had ever seen prior to 2000. And not only were they more frequent, they were more severe. Northwest Alaska's been getting winter thaws probably since Northwest Alaska started to exist. But they would last for a day or two. We'd go from 0 or 20 below up to maybe 30, 34 degrees for a day or two, and then it'd drop right back down. And it wasn't a huge deal. The way it has been in recent years around here is we're getting lots more precipitation in the summer and fall. We transition out of fall into winter. The only change is it goes from rain to sleet to mixed snow and rain, and then it freezes. And so the ground is saturated, the vegetation's covered with moisture, and then it drops to usually 0 to 20 above, even up here in Northwest Alaska. And then during the winter, after it drops down, we're getting 3, 4, 5, half a dozen rain on snow events during the winter. Those can be anywhere from, a day to maybe 4 days. Freezing fog. It's almost like drizzle. I never saw that prior to 2000, like I've been seeing it since 2000. And I think that's what initiated the current decline of the Western Arctic herd. Before I talk more about the Western Arctic herd, I want to make the bigger point that these rising temperatures, that's how it affected the Western Arctic herd. But for other herds, maybe in Eastern Canada, maybe in Scandinavia, maybe the major effect is on insect harassment. I know the Western Arctic herd now has probably an additional 2 or 3 weeks of insect harassment than they had back in the 80s and 90s when I started.
Wow.
And as I said earlier, insects are a huge factor. That's when they're laying down fat, the bulls, to carry them through the rut in the winter. That's when cows are lactating, and that imposes a huge physiological demand on those cows. They come out of summer and they don't look very good because they've been producing milk, the ones that didn't lose their calf. If you've got 2 or 3 additional weeks of insect harassment, that's a big deal. We're saying things out here. I'm not enough of a range ecologist to know the impacts, but just being out in the country a lot, I still fly a lot, that willow growth here has fundamentally changed. The willows are much higher, thicker. The gravel bars that used to extend for, a half a mile on the major rivers, They're completely under willows now. We're seeing the northward migration, if you want to call it that, northward extension of spruce trees, where there never used to be spruce trees. So it could be it's not just icing events that started the Western Arctic herd down. It could be that, plus insects, plus vegetation changes. Scandinavia, it may be a different mix of these individual um, impacts or manifestations of climate change. In some areas, maybe it's affecting not predator abundance, but just predator mobility. Snow conditions where caribou can almost stay on top of the snow, but not quite, will stay on top of that stuff just fine. So temperature has the potential to affect every aspect of caribou life and ecology. And it's the only thing I can think of that's driving all of these declines worldwide. I said, when we got into this, this is all new ground for all of us, and that's one of the scary things about it. We don't really know, as wildlife managers and biologists, what do we need to measure to document this? What do we need to do to try and offset some of these negative impacts on caribou? Some of the impacts on caribou that's not 100% bad news. Caribou benefit from warmer conditions in some places too. But from what we're seeing, the overall net effect on these northern adapted species like caribou and muskox and Dall sheep, Alaska Yukon moose, it's more bad news than good, and not by just a little bit. But that's another thing. It doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be so significant that you can see the change every year. All it has to do, these animals live so close to the edge, you only have to shift mortality in relation to recruitment of young into the population by a few percentage points a year. And in 10, 20 years, you've got a lot less caribou than you had before. Now with caribou, it's not acting subtly like that. I think we're seeing really a groundswell change, and it's happening fast. We've lost 3/4 of the Western Arctic herd in the last 23 years. That was one of the largest caribou herds in the world. We went from 490,000 caribou back around 2003. The census Fish and Game did last summer, 121,000 caribou. There's no indication that's starting to slow, that decline is starting to slow or reverse. They're continuing down. It's not just the Western Arctic herd. Again, it's 2/3 to 3/4 of the herds in the world. I've been doing a lot of talking here. I'll stop. But one other important point I really want to make. I think in terms of public awareness of what's going on, even though most people, especially people in the lower 48, they don't depend on caribou like people up here where I live. People every year, where's the caribou? Where's the caribou? You've been flying? I haven't found caribou. They depend on those for their food. It's not recreation. It's not quality of life. It's putting meat on the table for these folks. And it's something, it's even beyond that. It's part of their cultural identity. Just like hunters, they have this inner part of them that, by God, I'm a hunter. This is what I do. This defines me. Well, caribou help define not just people like you and I who love to hunt. It affects people out here. That it goes really to the essence of their culture, as well as mainly what's in their freezer. But I wanted to contrast that. We haven't had what we would all call probably normal levels of sheep in Northwest Alaska and Kotzebue Sound for at least 15 years now. You still can't hardly find a sheep here. I think the last decline, I think that was precipitated by icing, just as it did with caribou. I'm as concerned about moose numbers in this area, Kotzebue Sound, as I am about caribou numbers. I think they're going down too. Um, Maybe not as rapidly, not as dramatically yet, but the trends are all the same, and it's not just mammals. Our salmon runs in Kotzebue Sound and in other parts of Alaska too. They're a lot less dependable than they used to be in terms of timing, in terms of species composition, in terms of numbers. 3 years ago, we essentially had no chum salmon return to Kotzebue Sound. I've talked to, dozens and dozens of elders and said, boy, have you ever seen anything like that? They'd never seen that before, unprecedented. These are people that are 70 or 80 years old. It's not just fish. It's not just animals. It's birds. Cornell has come out with a number of studies over the last 7, 8 years showing estimates of bird numbers globally, and it's shocking to see the percentages that they report in terms of just bird abundance, not species disappearing, but just overall numbers. So for me, in my way of thinking, I can't think of anything besides climate change that could have such a widespread and dramatic impact on such a wide range of natural life on our world than climate change.
Jim, for most people across the nation, when we hear these numbers that there's, for example, 3 billion fewer breeding pairs of birds in America since 1970, or that some salamander population or amphibians are declining by 40%, let's say, or in this case, caribou on average down 65% across the Arctic. We hear these numbers, we see these statistics, and it's really hard to compute. It's really hard to make it feel tangible in any kind of way. First, because we as a species, I think we're not prepared to handle and understand, something at that scale, right? One death is a tragedy, but a million is a statistic. I think that's as true, for wildlife as it is, anything else. But you have had a up close and personal lived experience with something that's undergoing this kind of free fall. You have seen this Western Arctic caribou herd that you have been literally hands-on with decline from nearly 500,000 animals to now just over 100,000. Devastating decline. What does that feel like to see something you've spent a life studying for and stewarding and caring for? What has that been like personally for you?
Well, a range of emotions. It's terrifying, first of all. It's extremely worrisome. I mean, the climatologists are clear. They know what's driving global warming. It's our reliance on fossil fuels. And, not just in the last 10, 20 years, but since, the Industrial Revolution back in the early 1900s. So we've been digging this hole for decades, over 100 years, really. We're not going to turn it around in the next 5 or 10. I think for me, my main reaction is, besides sadness and terror, is frustration. I think we know what we need to do. The climatologists have been clear. We need to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. Look at the United Nations reports. They are very clear. If we're going to, limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, this is what we have to do, with regard to our reliance on fossil fuels, coal, gas, oil. And we're not doing it. The current administration, they're doing everything possible to take us in the other direction. It's bad science. I can tell you from my experience, it's not bad science. The scientists, like me, I'm one of them, we're all scared. We're frightened. I can't tell you how many caribou biologists that I've talked to, they've been close to tears talking about what's going on and what we might be able to do. Another part of the frustration is, I think people are getting it. I have never had a conversation with somebody who lives around here, a local person. And most of the people in the villages, they don't wake up to NPR. They don't read, the New York Times and the climate column and all this stuff. But I have never talked to any of them who have disputed the fact that temperatures are rising and we're seeing impacts. We're seeing impacts on not just caribou numbers. Caribou are coming off, Western Arctic caribou are coming off the North Slope 1 or 2 months later now than they did back in the 80s and 90s. I used to go to onion portage on the 1st of September every year because we knew that caribou had been crossing since the middle of August. I think it's been at least 5, maybe 6 years since they last conducted the onion portage collaring project. Even before I retired, it was getting really hard to get all of our collars deployed because the caribou weren't showing up. They've had to revert to collaring caribou using helicopter capture work, not chemical immobilization. They're using nut guns. But the point I want to make is caribou are coming off the North Slope so late that they're not at onion portage until there's ice in the river. You can't do it by boat anymore. Hunters could tell you lots and lots and lots of similar stories about where they have to go to find caribou and when they go there to get caribou. It used to be everybody tried to fill up with big bulls in the fall because they were the fattest. They weren't looking for antlers. They wanted fat over the hips. Now, by the time caribou get down to this region, the caribou have entered rut. Some years they're not only entered rut, they're coming through after rut. As soon as caribou go into rut, subsistence users generally stop taking bulls because the meat gets strong. They don't even want to cook it, much less eat it. So what they do, they still need meat. They do 2 things. They've switched to taking moose earlier because moose don't migrate like that. If you look hard enough, you can shoot moose in August or September. But they really want caribou. That's what these people want around here. And so they switch to cows. Well, that's not what you want to be doing on a herd that's declining, in a steady, 22-year decline. So I'm getting back to this frustration. Everything seems to be stacking up against people that are concerned and against caribou. I think in fairness to the people in the lower 48, they don't see caribou. There's no state outside of Alaska that has caribou anymore. It used to be Maine would get a few out of Canada. Idaho had a few. Those animals are gone. This is the last place. And when I moved to Alaska back in 76, caribou outnumbered people in Alaska. Not by 10 or 20,000. I mean, by hundreds of thousands of individuals. That's the Alaska that I miss. There's a lot of people that would disagree with me, especially politicians. And so when I say the word politicians, the next word that comes to my mind is frustration, because they know what needs to be done, but there is not the political will. They don't have the backbone to do what we need to do if we're going to have maybe not a herd of 500,000 caribou, but at least a herd where you have more than a permit hunt for one bull when you're lucky enough to be drawn, to have enough caribou that non-resident hunters can still come up here and hunt. We're very, very close to eliminating that, even for the Western Arctic herd. Most of the herds in Alaska now, there's no non-resident hunting anymore. What would have been unthinkable 20 years ago when I got here, that I never thought I'd see a day where it was tough to get caribou here.
So tell me this,
tough.
Jim, on the topic of politics a little bit here, decisions made by some policymakers. Amidst this free fall of caribou populations across the world, but definitely in Alaska specifically, where there seem to be a number of different overlapping pressures that are leading to these declines, many of which seem to be related to climate. What kind of impacts do you imagine there being if we were to take the current moment we're in and the current situation that caribou are in now, and then say turn their calving grounds into an oil field or develop a 200-mile industrial corridor that would split their migration route? Of course, I'm talking about opening up the coastal plain of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge where the porcupine caribou herd currently calves. Or I'm talking about the Ambler Road, which has been supposedly approved and fast-tracked to build a 200-mile industrial corridor bisecting the western Arctic caribou herd's migration route, and opening up a mining district and all of that. Some people hear that and they think jobs and they think economy and they think, good wages and they think improved, um, way of living, all, good things. But what does that mean for caribou? That's something that probably most people don't think about, but of course you do. What would something like one of those projects mean for these herds that are already herding in such a serious fashion?
That's an excellent question. It's something that I think about far more now than I did even when I was working, just because things, momentum is building in the wrong direction in terms of fish, wildlife, bird numbers, and impacts. Well, it's a complicated question. I think the people in Alaska are thinking about caribou. I mean, it's been in the news, both sides. The proponents of development are saying caribou crossroads. We got lots of roads in Alaska, and I agree. We've got decades of experience in Alaska showing that caribou herds can survive in areas that have roads. We know that. But when you look at the numbers and you think about what do we want, that's kind of where really the discussion is, not whether or not caribou cross roads, because we also have lots and lots and lots of information from the Western Arctic herd as they've approached the Red Dog Mine. There's a 52-mile long road out to the coast there, and it's some of the clearest biology I have ever seen. Biology tends to be messy. Animals do all kinds of stuff, even stuff that doesn't make sense. But with regard to the impacts of the Red Dog Road on Western Arctic herd movements, nobody can look at these maps that I've made and say they weren't affected. They were clearly affected. Tens of thousands of caribou have been affected every year when big numbers approach that road, and they weren't delayed for 3 or 4 days. They were delayed for up to 2 months.
Wow.
So every time some big resource extraction project is developed, it reduces options that caribou have to find the best mix of environmental factors to get them through the next year. I think ANWR has done a wonderful, just a magnificent job of teaching everybody that the calving grounds are sacrosanct. You got to have the calving grounds. You can't mess with them there. And I have disagreed with that for decades. What good is a pristine calving ground if they can't get to it because there's a 211-mile road that's stopping them? What good is if you have all these calves and they drop, but you've got some other big development, coal, say, over in the Lisburn Hills or near there, and they can't go over there and evade insects. Every time you build one of these projects, you reduce their options. And I've been saying for a number of years now that the critical resource for managers and people to protect is space for caribou. It's space to give them options to find the best combination of predator numbers, hunting pressure, vulnerability to icing, insect harassment, food availability, chances of icing events happening. That's about the worst thing that can happen to them in the winter. Every time we build a new gas line, we reduce options for caribou to access these areas. And the scary thing about roads, the footprint of a road really isn't very big. Even a 211-mile road, there's been some biologists that figured out, well, we're only going to lose 1,000 acres. What's the big deal? It's not how much tundra you cover with gravel. That road can act as a semi-permeable barrier or a total barrier to caribou movements. You can block access to hundreds of thousands of acres of habitat that they used to use whenever conditions called for it. That's what frustrates me about our politicians. Politicians want to be reelected. The best way to get reelected is to put money in people's pockets, make them feel good. And so all of their decisions are to maximize money for short-term gain. That almost never is in the best interest for wildlife and people who value and depend on them.
So, to oversimplify things, if I were to take everything you just said and try to boil it down to some kind of action item, I guess. When I listen to this, when I listen to anything like this, I inevitably quickly turn to, well, then what does that mean for us? What can we do? What action should I take? It sounds like one of the most tangible things we can do in the relatively short term is to try to preserve options for caribou to adjust to this changing world around them. So let's try to maintain these migration routes. Let's give them this open space and habitat they need. Is that, if you were to ask folks in the lower 48, maybe who are listening to this, who care about wildlife, who care about caribou, and they're thinking, hey, what can I do way far from so far away? Is simply trying to support that an important first step? Advocating for protecting these places, maintaining space and options for caribou. Is that focus area that makes sense?
Absolutely. I think you need to think of it in maybe two terms. What you said, protecting habitat for caribou, that's a short-term necessity. Right now with caribou on the ropes globally, we have the capability through either harvests or development to not necessarily exterminate caribou. We could. We probably won't. If they build the Ambler Road and then they extend that road west out to the coast to reach some deep water port, which is what I think the state of Alaska ultimately wants to do. Even at that, the Western Arctic herd probably isn't going to disappear completely. What we may end up with is what caribou herds on the road system are right now, herds that number maybe 40, maybe 50,000 caribou. But all those herds are intensely managed. There's almost no non-resident hunting for any of those herds. And the only subsistence hunting is by permit only through the state, where if you're lucky enough to get a permit, you can shoot one bull and you can do it in the fall, and that's it. There's not a family out here that can support themselves on one caribou. So really, what do you want? So that's a short-term thing to answer your question that people can do. These little, relatively little, a 211-mile road in the range of the Western Arctic herd sounds small. I hear pro-developers saying that all the time. It's only 211 miles. Look at the size of this range of this herd. It's a drop in the bucket. But it has the potential to wall off much more than just the area, within a mile or 2 or 3 miles either side of this road. They may lose access to a big area that they've used for wintering range in the past. But the road's not going to stop there. Anyway, if we want to have an Alaska where animals are a prominent characteristic of the state, it's not just big mountains and pretty rivers and lakes. It's wildlife too. People come to Alaska to see the mountains and the rivers, but by God, they want to see moose and they want to see a grizzly and they want to see numbers of caribou. And if they can see a wolf, man, that's really something. People want those things. So it's worth protecting those. So the last thing I'll say, it's really important. Your vote counts. And one of the terrifying things about caribou declines, everything else, is that I think we are moving past the period when wildlife managers could tweak seasons and bag limits and whether or not we hunt at all, whether they could try and reduce predator numbers, even perhaps through, liberalizing public regulations on trapping and hunting wolves or other predators, coyotes, whatever. We're at the point now where the decisions made in Washington, D.C. and in state capitals are going to have a much bigger impact on our fish, wildlife, and non-game species like birds, and also on the people who use, depend on, or just value these things than the wildlife biologists like I was. A decision to build the Ambler Road, for an example, that has the potential to do far more damage in, the 5 years that it takes to build the road than wildlife biologists have been able to counteract in the last probably 20, 30, 50 years. That scares me because politicians, from my experience with politicians, and I've talked to lots of them, a few of them even called me for questions, not very many, but a few. They don't know anything about animals. They live in D.C., they live in Juneau, they live in Lansing, Michigan, they live in all the state capitals. Some of them go hunting, but most of them are politicians, about 500 days a year. To have them making these big, huge decisions scares the hell out of me.
There's so much that you brought up there that I have thought about, and that to my earlier comments, seems outside of my understanding, or outside of my ability to influence change, or outside of the short-term purview of my own decision making and like my own choices and my own life. But one thing, when I look at this, we'll zoom back into the caribou example specifically. One personal relationship with this issue for both of us, I think, is hunting caribou. I've hunted caribou once, planning on doing it again soon. I understand you have as well. That's been a part of your life. How does everything you understand now influence that part of your life and how you engage with caribou, and in the future hunt them or not? How have you thought that through and processed that for yourself personally?
That's an excellent question. When I was working, the last 2 years of my career, I was a one-man traveling roadshow. I went to every village except one in this region. And it wasn't to talk about the Ambler Road or Red Dog and the Red Dog Road and crossing. It was to show villagers the population data. It was mostly me putting up graph after graph after graph and map after map, because they could understand those things. It was all laid out in front of them. It wasn't talking about statistics or, p-values or any of that. It was one of the most satisfying things I did in my career. And I wanted to make sure that they knew that we were entering into what I thought was going to be tougher times. And it's been playing out. I was right. Things are a lot worse now than they were back in 2016. And I think, anyway, during those presentations, one thing that I usually said to people, one of the characteristics of Inupiaq society is hunter success. There's other ones too. There's 10 or 12 things that are part of their culture, sense of humor and all these different things. Well, one of them was hunter success. And I said, boy, this has been so important to your culture for so long. But I think we need to redefine what hunter success is. Hunter success is taking absolutely no more than you can possibly get by on for food or whatever the reason. It's not okay anymore to shoot more than you need just to have a pad so that if, your neighbor needs some meat, you can give them some meat. We need we need to start thinking minimally. So in terms of my harvests, we ate caribou primarily. That was our primary source of meat until about 4 or 5 years ago. And I've shot 2 caribou in the last 5 years. The bag limit, is now it's 15 per year. I've never come close to shooting the bag limit. You can shoot 15 caribou a year right now for an Alaskan resident. One of those can be a cow. That is far too liberal. What's legal is not always what is responsible. So, like, I didn't get caribou this fall either, and it's not because I didn't try. I've worked my tail off for the last 4 or 5 years, and I couldn't find that. I never even set up a camp. So fast forward to November, and there's caribou just within 10 miles of town. But I take my cues from what the elders say, and if they say the bulls are no good to eat, I'm not going to shoot a bull, and I'm certainly not going to shoot a cow now, even if I legally can. So I would say, talking to all hunters, Alaskan hunters in villages in Kotzebue, again, people in the lower 48, Green Bay or LA or whatever, don't wait for the agencies or the politicians to tell you what you need to do. I think we're all smart enough, and most of the hunters that I know, it doesn't make any difference if you're from Wisconsin or if you're from Ambler. If you look at the numbers, you can see when things are going downhill. Just because it's legal to shoot 15 caribou a year, if you can get by on 2, and don't shoot cows. Do what's right. And I would say the same thing applies to climate change. If you can afford to get a hybrid car or, a clean car, or just even when you go to the polls, take the time, research the candidates, and if somebody is rabidly pro-development, that they are going to back any big project because it's going to put money in people's project without any concern about how that's going to affect the environment or the wildlife, keep looking. Try and find another candidate. Our votes count. That's showing right now with the administration we have in D.C. I think we're going to lose a lot of ground in the next 3 years environmentally.
I have one last question, and it's a selfish one.
I have 100 answers. You can't stop now.
Yeah. This is one last selfish question, Jim. I had the great fortune of getting to visit the Arctic Refuge last summer, and I was able to stand on top of a ridge and look out across the coastal plain, across the calving grounds of the porcupine caribou herd, and see all the way to the pack ice of the Arctic Ocean. And it is completely unblemished. It is the wildest, most vast, most untouched landscape I've seen in my entire life. And it was undescribable how reassuring it was to me to know that there was still some place like that, and that in some number of weeks there would be hundreds of thousands of caribou across that landscape with no impediment to their movement and their ability to give birth to tens of thousands of calves, and that this incredible cycle of life and migration would continue. And I remember standing there and thinking to myself that, gosh, I can't wait until my sons could come here someday and see this and experience this themselves. I have a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old, and I wanted so badly for them to see that and experience this. And then in that same moment, I thought to myself, will they get that chance? Or will this place right now that is this vast, incredible landscape that wildlife of so many kinds enjoy, will that be changed irreversibly in some number of years because of some of the things you're talking about? And that was a really difficult possibility to reckon with. I spent a lot of time sitting on that ridge by myself for several hours thinking about that. And then I came home and have continued to marinate in that thought. And then the other day, our mutual friend Bjorn sent me something he had written, and he was reckoning with a similar question, this question of the uncertainty of our future. And he made a connection that I have not been able to stop thinking about since. He wrote about an experience he had where he was in one of these places where there are caribou today, and he had this incredible encounter with them in this incredible place. And he thought to himself, will or am I in this moment like the hunters of 1870 were, or 1880 were, when they were still seeing these vast herds of buffalo and had no idea that in just a number of decades they would all be gone? Were we in this moment now? Are we in this moment now? Just like those people in the 19th century who thought the buffalo would continue on forever, and then one day they did not? We're faced now, I think, or at least I am reckoning with now with this uncertainty of if that might be the case with caribou. And as you've talked about, many, many other things maybe too. I'm 38 years old. I do not have all the answers. I have a lot of questions. You have been able to reckon with these things a bit longer than I have. And I'm curious how you do that. How do you reckon with this uncertainty that you are experiencing even more firsthand than I am, and that you've seen more up close and personal than even I have? With this final thought from you, I'd love to understand how you are dealing with this uncertainty and looking into the future.
Well, I'm doing this the exact same thing that you are, Mark, except my youngest kid is 46 now. I'm 74. My oldest is 51. But the youngest one, he lived until 2 years ago, he lived in Kotzebue. So we started getting his little boys out at about age 2 or 3. And he and I have had this conversation countless times, lots of times intense. We're doing it now because we're afraid that when his kids, they're 8 and 10 now, about the age of yours, when they're my age, unless there are big changes in the United States about our priorities in terms of quality of life things and not protecting and preserving wild areas and wildlife, they're not going to be here. And this isn't just wild speculation. Look at the East Coast of the United States. How many, that was all indigenous people back before Columbus got here. They were all subsistence users, 100%. How many actual functioning subsistence tribes are on the East Coast of the United States? I'll speculate here. I would say zero. Not subsistence the way they do it in Ambler still. So we know where we're headed. We've been down this road for a couple hundred years. We know where the Ambler Road leads. It doesn't lead just to the Ambler Mining District. It leads us to where New Jersey is now. I'm scared as hell. I'm 74. I'm at the other end of the spectrum. But just like you, worrying about your kids, I'm worried about my grandkids and their kids. And I'm really worried about caribou and wild places. I love Alaska. I love its wildlife. But one of the things that really doesn't get a lot of press is that, I'm a pilot, I've got a Cub. In a half an hour, I can be to some place where I don't see anybody else. I don't hear other airplanes except during the hunting season. I don't hear snow machines. It's getting so hard in this, even in our country that tends to, it's still has a high quality of life, but it's become almost impossible to find solitude now. That's at stake too, and it's worth a lot. Alaska will be much diminished if we don't have more than just remnant populations of moose and caribou and sheep and muskox if we can't find solitude. I really hate to think of our state going that way. really frightens me.
Well, Jim, uh, we have a lot. All of us have a lot to think about, to try and find ways that each of us in our own ways can do something to move things in a more positive direction. But I want to thank you for what you have already done over decades in studying these animals, in advocating for these animals in wild places, and helping us understand them in such a way that we have the data and the knowledge to make informed decisions, which again today I think you've helped us do as well with this conversation. So thank you for all of that work, and thank you for this chat today, Jim.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to appear on your podcast. And I want to thank you for getting this out there. This is what we need now. What you're doing is at least as important as everything I did as a biologist. You're getting the word out to people who vote, to people who can make a difference. It's not going to be safe. Things aren't going to be turned around by a bunch of biologists like me, or even climatologists that are, looking right directly in the mouth of the beast and telling us what's going to happen. It's guys like you that are getting the word out to voters. That's incredibly important, and I really thank you and everybody like you doing this.
Well, we all have our role to play, and I have faith that each in our own way will do just that. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark.